We now have a session on open source first policies for DPI implementations. This will be a policy focused discussion on enabling DPG adoption through open source first procurement, highlighting cost, governance, and sovereignty considerations for DPI implementations. We have John Llyod here with us, and I will leave the session for him to take over.
Great. Hi, everyone. Lovely to have you here. As Taylor said, it's an afternoon session on day 2. We all just had a snack. Hopefully everyone's feeling a bit awake, but recognizing the time, Krisstina, I know you got a jet? At 5, so we'll be done by 5. I might even get my phone out so I can keep an eye on the time.
That's okay.
So what we're talking about today is open source first policies for DPI implementation. And just before I kind of get going, I'll give a bit of background on how we even got to this point, which is at the DPGA Secretariat, we kind of recognized that lack of having an open source first policy was hindering the implementation of digital public goods and other open source tools. And before we even kind of got going to figure out where the interventions may be, we formed what we're calling a call for collaborative action with other DPGA members. And in all, 32 DPGA members decided to participate in this call. We identified that there needed to be a survey of governments and other government institutions of where are things with open source implementation at the moment? Like, do people even have a policy? Are they thinking about it? If they do have a policy, is it being enforced? Are there other considerations that need to be made? And as a result of this report, we worked with a former civil servant from the Dominican Republic, Melissa Munoz. I was hoping we'd have Isaac in the room with us, but we don't. But from there, she distilled all the findings from our survey. By the way, the survey is still open. You can find it on the DPGA website in our blog section. And from that, we ended up with 4 policy recommendations in order to help the better implementation of open source within governments. And out of those 4, Krisstina and I here are just going to kind of discuss what they were, how they're being implemented, if being implemented at all, some of the challenges and all of that kind of thing. So it'll be relatively rapid fire. We'll have a chance for you to ask questions at the end, but let me just cover what the 4 are in discussion with Krisstina, and then we'll get going. Krisstina, before we go, maybe you want to introduce yourself.
I should. I also realize Emily is not here, so I could be Emily and just stand in for you, Nick. Hi, everyone. I'm Krisstina. I work with Co-Develop Fund, which is an organization helping governments, civil society, other stakeholders adopt safe and inclusive DPI. But today on stage, I'm representing my work at University College London, where we've built something called the DPI map. It's a project to study how governments are adopting DPI across the globe. In order to do that, we had to take the definition of DPI, break it into 70 components or so, and say which country has which of these 70 components, and lay it all out in a beautiful map. If you want to check it out, it's on dpimap.org. And that's the capacity in which I'm going to talk about open source policies. What does it mean for governments to implement it? How does it engage with public sector capabilities? Things like that. Thanks, John, for the invitation.
Excellent. Well, it was really great to have you join. Krisstina did join relatively last minute, so big thanks for that. So as I mentioned at the start, there are 4 recommendations that came out of this kind of analysis of the landscape of open source policies and how they're being implemented. And the first recommendation out of the report is pretty simple, which is have open source by default. This means implementing open source clauses in having open source clauses in every request for a proposal, requiring exemptions to be justified, published, and also time-bound. There was also kind of an idea of bringing together a total cost of ownership methodology that includes the initial acquisition price of software, but critically, plus the cost of installation, migration, maintenance, support, training, updates, and the eventual exit or replacement, which often, that's often a massive afterthought. In addition to this, establishing a mandatory national registry of public software, including license and support metadata, and conduct annual audits to identify exceptions. So, Krisstina, what are your kind of reflections on that? Because at least one thing that I've seen and what came out in our survey is that some countries actually do have this open source first policy, but a policy or anything is only as good as the enforcement of it, right?
Yeah. So maybe stepping back, just because my participation here was really last minute, also just to check the pulse of the room. How many people know what DPGs are? That's a lot. That's more than I
Great,
guessed.
Rowan. If you didn't put your hand up, I kind of...
How many people know what DPGA is? Okay, slightly less, so maybe we do an explainer. How many people think DPGs and open source are one and the same thing? Nobody? Oh, do you wanna speak to that? It's okay. I have a lot of controversial takes also. That's why John invited me. I'll offer something from the map already. I did a quick search on Perplexity before I came on stage to ask how many governments across the globe already have open source policies. And it said, Krisstina, if you're thinking about national governments, it's 50. If you're thinking about subnationals, it's way more. And now I'm thinking, what does it mean for a national government and a subnational government to have an open source first policy? What does it mean for procurement? What does it mean for enforcement, for implementation? Probably a complex job to implement. When we started mapping this out at the DPI map, our starting point was always, what does the country have? Because we cared more about DPI than what got to the point of DPI. So for us, it mattered relatively less whether government used proprietary tech or used a DPG with a SI or a private vendor to implement it and build their DPI. It just mattered to us that they had the capabilities that prove that they have DPI. But one of the enablers, and a very important enabler, is to figure out if the government has a mechanism to absorb DPGs, because we don't want only proprietary tech forming these modules that then form a country's DPI. And it's very difficult to find these policies. So I'm going to ask Perplexity where the 50 are. But when you start investigating where these open source policies are, you're going to find maybe interoperability guidelines. You're going to find maybe hidden in procurement policies some preference for a keyword around open source would be great. You're also maybe going to find specifications around what these open source tools should look like, what standards could look like. It can easily reach higher degrees of sophistication. And then there's a further complexity. What does it mean to implement this? Is this a guideline that affects a pathway like procurement? Is it a guideline that affects which kind of vendors you can work with and what their package looks like and what their offering looks like? TBD, there's no standard, there's no benchmark. So even if there are 50, it's really difficult to think of that pipeline from creating and designing a policy around open source first, and then situating it in public sector capability to implement it and create a mandate around it and have everyone in that same government implement it in much the same way. There is a carrot, because you know what to do if you want to do it, but there is no mandate to check if you're doing it the same way. And that's going to affect open source adoption. Also, that being said, I think having the policy is a great first step, but having worked in policy, I know it matters less to what comes after. Governments are going to ask, how do we implement this policy? And I think the article goes on to talk about what these pathways look like, and I'm very excited to discuss that.
Great segue. So the second recommendation in our report is making sure that there's legal clarity around licensing. So publishing a practical licensing manual, defining minimum sectoral standards to ensure interoperability, require that all publicly funded software includes standardized metadata files as well. And this is kind of step one for operationalizing that policy, as you were saying, but do you kind of see this being a challenge in terms of that, having some legal clarity coming from the government as part within that policy or otherwise?
I'm thinking of an instance. So we wanted to study if governments had the capabilities, the DPI-like capabilities to do data exchange. And we realized later, data exchange is also happening when you sign a two-way or a three-way MOU between government departments to say this data can go here. You're allowed to access it. Data is being exchanged. You can also do data exchange through an API manager of sorts where it's a host of keys. You know what exists where. If you want to link to it, you can. It's not happening in an automated way, but if you want to access it and you have the key, you can access it. And then there's something like X-Road, where it's an ecosystem in itself of consent, of security layers, where data storage and sharing and validation and auditing is all happening within the same kind of technical ecosystem. And we found so many different ways to do it that we're not convinced there's one pathway to do something that seems as simplistic as data exchange. So when we looked at interoperability, which kind of becomes a crux for data exchange to happen, we boiled it down to a proxy of, we started calling it semantic interoperability, to say, is the data from one place readable by another? And hence, if that's defined as a standard, then can you write that into guidelines around open source? Can you write that into guidelines like procurement, whatever rules you create for tech adoption within the public sector? Turns out what we were calling semantic interoperability is actually maybe only syntactic interoperability. And I learned this word 3 weeks ago, so I'm excited to see the head nod. That means something. But all it means is the syntax is the same. It doesn't mean that the syntax is readable by this other system. I don't know how open source policies can make space for so much in terms of giving the government a vision on how to procure and regulate and integrate, as well as define more rules of those integrations so that things are happening more or less systematically rather than just with that North Star and vision. We haven't found anything at the DPI map, but the question always is, maybe we're not looking in the right place. So if anyone here has examples on what sort of open source first policies seem like models or seem like exemplars of governments doing this well, and then also laying out a pathway of implementing that guideline and that policy, we'd love to hear about it.
Well, funnily enough, on the Digital Public Goods Alliance blog, which is digitalpublicgoods.net/blog, we have a whole report which dives into and identifies some of those countries on a little what's kind of like a toolkit broken down by different stages of digital maturity status from implementing countries. So you can find out a little bit more on there. Our third recommendation here is around formalizing community contributions. And when I think of open source, the community is such a big part of it. But there needs to be some way to really capture that community spirit. And I think there are a lot of open source projects which have done this really well in the non-government sector. But formalizing those community contributions in the form of publishing a standard contribution policy in like repositories on GitHub, funding maintenance and security through time allocation programs or bounties, establishing community metrics such as bug resolution times or number of reuses, and having that all displayed on open dashboards. Is that something that you think could be taken from this, I guess, I hate to say private sector side of open source, so like the Mozillas, the Linuxes, that type of thing, that can be applied in this government context?
I would ask a question back. I feel like I honestly don't know enough about how these communities operate. It is when I first came across how open source tools are built and how much of it is volunteer driven, I was really taken aback by how much of it came from just alignment with a common vision and a common goal. And there's no other incentives that drives this certain community. A big part of this specific vision keeps that same community driving in the same direction, because you want to keep making access to that goal better, more effective. You want your product to be better, so on and so forth. Now we're thinking of taking open source in a context of service delivery, where a public sector now bears a responsibility to use that same tool to deliver at scale. And now the same community of volunteers is expected to be accountable to using that tool for delivery at scale. And I have a question. I don't know where that capacity comes from, and I don't know who creates those accountability mechanisms, and whether that comes from within the community and they can be sort of incentivized to rise up to the challenge, or that incentive comes from outside, from funders, from the government. Where does it come from? Because that an understanding of the incentive and the accountability mechanism that drives that incentive is kind of central to answering that question, and I don't know enough to answer that. So I'm curious. Anyone here knows? I'd love to know.
We will have time for Q&A in about 5 minutes. And our last recommendation, which came out of this report, was what you had kind of alluded to earlier on in your opening, which is having a sustainable institutionalization of open source within governments. And what the report is suggesting is establishing an open source program office, otherwise known as an OSPO, with fixed budgets, indicator reporting, creating permanent funds for the maintenance of critical software, require security by default through CBOM and SBOM rather, and vulnerability disclosure programs, and define clear rules on the duration and transfer of projects. And as I said, like you had kind of said that this was one of the most promising ways, and we've heard in other sessions just while we're here that like there is this sort of institutional confusion sometimes of who's actually in charge of this implementation of a piece of DPI, or if a certain agency is, maybe they're not given the mandate to say health and education, you have to be plugging into this. And so this feels like, to me at least, a way of addressing some of those challenges, so long as your OSPO is a multi-stakeholder thing.
I have an example to offer, again, hoping that this is not the only example, but it's the example I know of because I'm based in Germany. When I think of OSPOs, I see a perfect blend of open source being institutionalized, because while you're thinking of the credibility of the code and the value it adds, you're also thinking about what it means to use that as a tool for delivery. And you're thinking about financial sustainability, institutional capacity. One really good example of a country being able to do this successfully is the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany, where the government has realized that there are certain open source tools that are now become critical infrastructure to a government's functioning, and the trade-off of having them evaporate because they can't be financially sustained to them not being able to use them anymore is too expensive for them to bear, so they'd rather finance it publicly. And so they've started investing in certain tools that they regard as critical infrastructure. Maybe it's a new strategy, maybe over time they realize that there's too many infrastructures that they're supporting and that's not sustainable anymore. But it's a beginning of thinking about how open source tools enter an ecosystem of delivery and actually get sustained towards delivery goals. And that's very exciting to me. It's in line with the OSPO model, because the OSPO model also believes in situating open source tools in contexts of use cases and actually delivering that for users. And I'm exposed to the work of the OSPO Health, again, based in Berlin, But I know it's a model where we're thinking of both the tool and the mechanism to get access to the tool at scale, which is what DPI is trying to do. So it's an exciting operational model, and I think we need to think of more such models. If we're thinking of the financial sustainability around open source and regarding them increasingly as critical parts of a country's digital infrastructure.
Yeah, and the survey was really interesting in that pretty much everyone had said that the importance of governments instituting policies and principles that can better facilitate the adoption of open source was a recurring answer that just kept coming up. Time and time again, it was shared that open source adoption really thrives most in those countries that are formalizing them and willing to invest. As you were saying, like, I think there is a monetary component to making open source work, and that's super important. We have 4 minutes. Kristina's got to run, but we what a rapid fire. And so I'm going to just open the floor up to questions. So I can go for it, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm wondering if community contributions aren't enough, is free and open source software. Sorry, I'll say it again. If community contributions will not be enough to build infrastructure-grade products that run the next generation of public services, if Claude Code does a better job, you know, for example, do we need to finally unbundle free and open source software and make it non-heretical to say that perhaps software shouldn't be free because public accountability does cost money? We do this with water. We think of water as near free. It is in fact not free. You pay for the water, and you pay the amount that the infrastructure board determines is required to sustainably produce it, and people, except in the UK where we've somehow managed to mess this up, you know, it tends to work reasonably well. But I think free and open source software is quite a radical bundling. And if we think DPGs are fundamentally about sharing best practices, fantastic. Those best practices don't need to be free.
You've made a good point about the privatization of a natural monopoly with your UK example, which I could talk about all day. I'm from the DPGA. I believe if it's going to be a DPG, then like using your water example, like the creation of the water should be free, like accessing the water. Water in New Zealand is free. You pay for the waste. And I think that's fair. So what you're actually paying for with the water isn't the implementation, or isn't so much the creation, it's more the ongoing maintenance and development of the water infrastructure and all that kind of thing. And that's very similar to open source, I guess, which is if you want this consistently delivered in the standards that we require, then it requires money. And that's where I think the financial component comes in. But if we want to maintain, I think, the ability for community to contribute, there needs to be some kind of money behind it. That's personal, by the way. That's not a DPGA opinion.
Are there other questions, just in the interest of time?
We have
or
time.
Answers, because
We
I
have
asked
time
a
for
bunch
one
of
more.
questions also.
Or just perspectives. Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Might be this is not a real apt question, but how resilient is DPGA to a cyber attack?
The DPGA?
Will a cyber attack shake the foundation of your belief that open source is the best and the be-all? Or do you still believe that there can be a closed source but still can be maintained in a better way for digital public infrastructure delivery?
Well, I mean, I'll use an example of a DPG called X-Road. It's probably the most pen-tested piece of technology in the entire world. It was developed by Estonia, and it is... How many attacks did they get per day? It's like 60 to 100 per day. So I think on the security side, DPGs are... I wouldn't say they're like more secure or less secure, But at least you can tell what the security features are because they're open source. That's the thing. Like, you can assess it because they're open source, whereas a proprietary system, no idea. It's a black box. But James.
Wasn't planning to talk about security. Other than to say, I think that generally the challenge there is less, are we talking about open source or proprietary software, and much more how are we managing the systems? How are we responding to changing environments? I think my question is the conversation we need to have one of policy or of strategy? And my sense is that most governments find policy relatively easy. Connecting that to strategy is the hard bit. And that, my feeling is, we need to probe that a little bit more and push that this is well beyond an open source policy. It's a much wider strategic conversation.
I would totally agree. I'm also going to hype up the part 2 to our report, which is on our blog. So we released part 1, which were the initial survey results back in November last year. So if you are looking at the blog, go down to November. But within the next month, we're going to be posting part 2, which incorporates, we had twice as many responses in the meantime. We did some deep dive interviews, but it does get into moving beyond policy, getting into that strategic piece and what's required. So, cool. And I think we're at time. Unfortunately, we have to go.
Unfortunately.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.